Greetings, all my nighttime lovers and vampire story lovers too. I'll get on with it quick, but I've just been a bit encouraged for the dozen or so people. Doesn't sound much, it is a lot to me, but the dozen or so people who listened to the entire story I put up before in two parts. So this is part one of another story, a vampire thing with a twist, and it jumps between three different ages, which is 86, around about 1400, and around about 0 AD, just like but it starts in Edinburgh. So it's a prologue. Edinburgh, 1986, and the nightclub was bouncing hard. All of the underground venues were. The vast majority of mainstream clubs were doing the business too, although they were very much for weekenders only. Not your serious, generally hedonistic, professional party freaks. The Hoochie Coochie Club, simply referred to as the Hooch, was one of the best underclubs in the city. It catered to the passionate and still rebellious post-punk genre of what the average person in the street would categorise in general as goth. A title that irritated on levels which would be pointless even attempting an explanation to a mere weekender. It was a venue loved by the serious dressers-uppers, posers and cool cunts of Edinburgh's beautiful people, who considered the act of readying your body to go out, and especially to go out clubbing, as an art form. It was also a favourite haunt for the extraordinarily fabulous drag queens and devotees, and transgender communities accompanied with the bi, tri and not fucking shy people, all with their young wide-eyed chickens. They were the sort of dudes that Bowie insisted carry the news, and many weekenders or just plain looky-looks people would alter their routes in order to gaze at the queues of boogaloos entering the hooch. With wild-styled and brilliantly coloured hair merely the start, only the most gorgeous, mature and life-loving clientele need attempt to gain entry. If your face, with cosmetics a must, doesn't fit, then please feel welcome to try somewhere less trendy. One of the regulars was standing on his own, in highly unusual state for him. He had lived in Edinburgh for a few years now and absolutely loved the night pulse of the city. Vibrant and strong, mirroring the look of its ancient and historical architecture. He resided in the centre of the old town, down one of several almost medieval closes that sat hidden in plain sight all along the Royal Mile towards Holyrood Palace. The man was of strong opinion that the very roots of the city had bones of solid stone, and ever he had felt empathy with such special places. Currently, and covertly, his whole attention was fixed upon an undeniably stunning woman currently sat at one of the tables, with a few of whom the man assumed were friends. Certainly, to his very, very well-trained eyes, it was obvious none of them were her lover or even chaperone, and that was all he cared about for now. She was recently arrived to the city. The man knew that, as surely as he knew that by next week he'll have made her acquaintance and so much more. If the woman had been aware of just how much an unseen and unknown man knew about her, she would be confused and astonished. And not just a wee bit frightened. By now, though, it perhaps doesn't matter. The allure of Edinburgh was subtle, sublime even. Regardless of who you were, your stature, wealth, status or promising talent, when the underbelly of the city of Edinburgh was truly discovered and accessed, well, it gave to life a meaning that was easily understandable and very difficult to extract oneself from. Part 1. Future site of Vatican City, O2 AD. In a part of the world that the Etruscan society referred to as Vatica before the Romans settled in the area was an unappealing marshland known as Ager Vaticanus. Nothing productive could be gleaned from the large, saturated, weed-strewn site which was left alone. This suited a species that walked the earth in secret beside the human beings, although few was the number of humans aware of this fact, and very few indeed was the count of this unseen species. And deep below the wetlands on the surface, there existed what would have to be called, or nay, demand to be named, as an underground temple of exceptional size. Deep underground, with accommodations and room for over 300 of beings, all surrounding an acoustically perfect main meeting chamber capable of seating such a number and more. It was quite beautiful. Grey stone walls and carved columns enabled and supported a curved ceiling, with the architecture reflecting the austerity of the times, which was plain and subdued. There was little that could be called decoration, and no need was there for any. The creation as a whole was a work of remarkable art. Construction had been completed almost 6 centuries previously in the utmost of secrecy. After 70 years and 100, using innumerable and completely expendable labourers, enslaved and helpless to the dark will of the architects, taught how to properly wield and work with certain provided forged tools which seemed like wizardry to the slaves, eventually a wonderfully spacious creation was there finished. Sadly, so finished also were the lives of all the remaining workforce at that time. Secrecy was ever written at the top of the dark species' primary laws, whose relatively short list of edicts were ironically considered sacrosanct. For living within periodically, or for the private holding of black meetings of varying import slightly less frequently, it was surely perfect. Primarily, however, its purpose was for the offering of diabolical prayer and for corrupted periods of ungodly worship and immoral reflection, away from any human interference or vision. For dark and black-hearted were the services and sermons to the faithful of this impious church. Not to aspire to heaven's gardens did they, due to being already in the ranks of the dead. No, to remain in this not living yet not dead state was their desire, and long they had succeeded in this, whilst remaining unseen. Even though their ranks practiced necessary disciplines within criteria of the harshest and strictest parameters to preserve this unseen and secret status, there was a conference about to be debated regarding a growing threat in the outside human world, which must be full assessed by appointed members of the Night Assembly, as their administration was so named at these senior and high levels. It had ever been known and permitted that certain members of the human species should be made aware of the Dark Assembly's existence. This had been, after many moons of debate long, long ago, correctly deemed to be of essential benefit. Only humans from nobility or the most capable sort were selected to be even assessed for possible approach. And this sage stratagem had proved to be extremely symbiotic in many unanticipated ways, benefiting both species greatly. And over long centuries, there were friendships of brotherhoods forged, affinity and camaraderie that lasted robustly through generations of humans. Even by that time, they were names of noble and academic repute in the civilized world that had enduring and inviolable relationships with the species in the shadows. A small gong sounded out. It was a soft noise, but audible to all. And by the time the pleasant after echo had subsided, everyone's speech had stopped, save a low murmur here and there. Quiet, quiet, I say. The speech used was an ancient tongue, laden with lost words of misty origin. Latinesque in sound, it was a fell language, derived from even more evil primal utterings, and at this time in the history was spoken and understood by less than 500 beings in the entire world. An infinitesimally small count, even in despite of the fact that the global population was significantly lesser at this point in history. 100 or so of these people were present to hear what was spoken. "It is now the time appointed," was said out gravely. "I proclaim this gathering of the assembly now in open session." The authority carried within these words was undeniably superior, and was sounded with a tone that suggested attention need be paid to these words. It was known that no mere bicentennial assembly was this, due to the hurried nature of the call. An outright crisis was still remained unthinkable by the majority. After all, their measures of precaution were excellent, but something of great import was afoot. During pre-meeting talks, the consensus was that it would be regarding one or more unpermitted, which were humans allowed to live on as undead, usually due to sympathy for the human, or much worse, actual love. The High Assembly had a special team, rather unimaginably titled the Whites, who dealt with this prohibited issue, however, so there was some confusion being debated around this topic, with all turning their now quietened focus to the man who had spoken, bowing their heads slightly as they did so, such was his status among their species. Their gaze was landed on an hooded and robed figure of imposing height, which contributed to the sense of power that radiated from him and over his audience, which comprised some 40 of his own species and a slightly larger count of gentlemen and ladies of nobility and of high standing in cities and countries, generally defined as civilized by the rest of the humans' world. This senior figure was wise and sagacious, with a statesmanlike bearing. He was known as the Master. He wielded such power that he could decide the fate of a countless number of beings with a wave of his hand. Fortunately for the other inhabitants of this world, humans, he was as wise as he was as far-sighted and perceptive. My friends, the Master paused a brief moment before continuing. We are here met not to decide, for I myself have made the decision. We are met to agree upon our future, for should we remain on the path we are walking on, even as I state this to you, then we are headed towards our demise within this century now begun. There was a hum of low murmurings heard as some members whispered amongst themselves, which was, strictly speaking, against protocol. But the Master understood the consternation they felt. He too had been stunned by the results of their recent calculations based on their traditional methods of accounting. My intention is to have our figures double-checked and have dispatched already a request to our human confederate, King Hero of Syracuse, begging of him to send his mathematician Pythagoras to aid us in this count. The Master raised his hand as if to hush the chamber, although all was quiet. I have also made a request for our confederate friend Archimedes to attend aside him due to the extreme gravity of the situation. This time a cacophony of protestations did arise in chamber, and the Master did not intend to allow any loss of focus. Silence, I say. He had raised his voice only lightly, but the effect was instant. And quite quiet once more there was. Well known are Archimedes' peculiarities, as strong as the genius that flows from his mind, and to avail ourselves of his talent, we will. The weight of significance in this grim matter dictates we use all avenues open to us vigorously in the hope we can ever resolve this perilous issue. The Master had deliberately infused anger into his voice so that his next statement, spoken with solemnity, had a backbone of firm resolve. My friends, another pause in order to ensure maximum impact, but also to detach all emotional content from his tone. This resulted not in a disconnect from the loyal members, but rather it provoked an evolutionary higher plane of communicatory perception attainable only by their own species and a few humans of exceptional ability affiliated to their dark church, so that the Master barely had to whisper for his words to feel like a hammer blow to everyone present. As he said, in the simplest terms, we must exercise deepest, most difficult disciplines with as much thoughtfulness and care available to us. If we do not do this well, then it is a mathematical certainty we will cease to exist ere this century ends. The chamber was appalled and dismayed, with astonished, awestruck members struggling to absorb the Master's words. Possible, if not certain extinction. More there was said, and more there was discussed for long hours afterwards, but amounted to the same issue in the end. The last official decree by the Master that day and night was when he was bringing the assembly to a close. We will meet here again after 12 moons have passed and our calculations have been refined by the world's finest minds, and also to allow our whites to complete their own given tasks, which are very important to our cause also. Stay vigilant and operate in even deeper covert manner, if that be at all possible in the lives you live outside this sanctuary. And due to the fact the path we are walking is but a knife edge poised to sever the thread on which our doom hangs, let me remind everyone the penalty for allowing any not permitted is death without prejudice or mercy, for we can afford none. Carpe diem. Many of both species stayed in the main chamber for many hours afterwards, debating most of what had been talked about, and no dunces were there amongst those lofty ranks. None present could deny the disquiet they felt in their bellies, however. The Transvaal, southeastern Europe, 1422 AD. The darkness was almost total, with only the smirking moon flickering through the periodic gaps in the thick canopy of large, ancient trees offering glimpses of an old rutted horse trail. Frequent flashes of blinding lightning only served to confuse and confound. Sheets and sheets of heavy, torrential rain were intensified by gusts of wind from every angle, and only the dimmest of scared light escaped from swinging, banging lanterns strapped loosely from the sides of the 2 horse-drawn carriages thundering along the trail before it was consumed by the dark immediately, as the blackness offers it little hope of illuminating anything. Each carriage had 8 horses pulling them at speeds unimaginable to a common man, though neither of the men guiding their steeds with such abandon were common. The foam flecking the horses' mouths was replaced as fast as their lashing rain cleansed it. The flashes of light made their eyes seem over large and a shade of white more striking than was natural, but somehow also an hellish red. The poor doomed animals were already far past the point of any chance of recovery, but were raced insanely onwards nevertheless, whinnying with terror, sounding out loudly even over the storm, and cracking whips which were being wielded brutally, constantly, and at times unnecessarily. The men have faces set as determined as animals also, like predator and prey and parasite and cure. If the sodden earth had any heart, then it was of faithless rhythm, and unnatural dreadfulness blanketed all. The world was flying past them at impossible pace, as if glad to be rid of the part it was playing this night. Death, its fell presence, was discernible in the air, waiting, knowing, content to bide its time. The heavy wagons thundered along relentlessly at insane speeds, despite the darkness of the night becoming blacker as the moon was completely obscured by tree and cloud. The grim pursuit and frantic evasion attempts could not for long have successfully continued on a barely discernible track. There had already been several ominous crackling noises throughout both carriages for some time now, so it wasn't completely without warning when the axle in the front coach split. but it was a sudden and awful event. A very loud snapping sound was followed by tearing screams, and a terrible fear filled the night as the horses were dragged onto their sides, some being horribly broken and crushed into the disintegrating parts of the stout, heavy wooden carriage. And then the second coach impacted brutally onto the wreck. The lead horses had attempted to leap the horror-strewn obstacle, condemning themselves to a certain end, either sudden or sadly otherwise, as dozens of spear-like lances of broken oak wood fatally pierced many. Some do manage to get loose and run on insanely into nowhere, shocked and exhausted unto their end, whilst some lie speared and twisted and sound out in unbearable pain from grievous injury and suffering. The men heard absolutely nothing of this as they now stood and faced one another, each aware that a mortal clash was imminent, and each of them were ready to embrace the challenge in their own way. Both men were fine warriors. Their focus on the moment was total. Dr. Abraham Van Helsing discarded his bulky, sodden coat as he stood. He turned his attention to his belt and seemed satisfied. He addressed the figure in front of him. "It is over now, sir, and sure I am that this is known to you." With deserved respect for his foe, he added, "A worthy and honourable adversary you have been, for little else would be expected from the Prince of Wallachia." But no, Van Helsing continued, and now anger there was in his voice, "But no one else will be killed or otherwise by your tainted hand. The Assembly of Rome, the Master and the actual Assembly Whites, mark you, have been all too patient with regards to your perversions, and you were notified of the displeasure your excesses had brought on several occasions." Van Helsing looked at the man in question. Count Vlad Dracula, titled Prince of Wallachia, but widely known and described as Vlad the Impaler. He was undeniably a fine warrior and skilled military general, but was also an unbalanced and outright sadist, whose battlefield atrocities had long provoked outrage, or applause depending on what side you were fighting on, though many of his own forces were aghast at his enjoyment of the horrific acts of sheer barbarism. However, it was his private rituals involving sacrifice, bloodletting, and other brutalities of unspeakable horror which were now anything but secret, and being whispered about by the very cream of European elite, and that had forced the Assembly to act. This unacceptable and dangerous situation had to end, and right now at that. Van Helsing held a wooden icon in his hand that was blessed and pure. It had once been set apart of a set of 4, used to nail Jesus Christ himself to the cross, but taken and smuggled away by some of the Christian faithful whose successors eventually affiliated themselves with the Assembly. The fight against true evil indeed has many faces. Van Helsing leapt at Count Vlad with astonishing dexterity, and there ensued a fearful fight. Unheard and unseen by anything in the rain-swept darkness, The pair were hard and fast in combat, but swift and more adept was Van Helsing, and showing superb close contact skill, flipped his opponent onto the mud, trapping the Count's arms behind him, long enough for him to thrust the blessed stake through Dracula's heart. "I am sorry, old friend," said Van Helsing, softly but clearly audible in the tempest, and with real sorrow, as Dracula's blood gouted black from his heart, smelling corrupt and of mortification. "It need not have come to this, had you but heeded the Assembly's code." The wind-wet and dark night grew deeper and noisier, as though in anger at the events occurring in its midst. "The number is 104, shouted Van Helsing as he tensed his body for the final blow. The Count's soulless heart must be fully transfixed by this blessed relic. Van Helsing pushed with all the strength left afforded to him and felt the relic go full through the unbeating black heart. Falling atop of his vanquished foe, Van Helsing felt spent. The Assembly order, especially the Whites, would be most gratified, he uttered to himself, and his fleetingly vague thoughts, before falling unconscious for almost an hour, he barely managed to gasp out, "At last, the rogue vampire Dracula's defeat is total, with the majority of his not permitted accounted for, and the remaining few near elimination." And so it was. Almost. The Impaler had mere seconds of a long enough life left to him. He considered laying back to die, and prepared to do so. ... Back to future site of Vatican City, 03 AD, where the Master has called the next gathering of the full assembly to order. This is where I'm going to end it for the moment. It's just over 33 minutes, I think, so that should be just nicely enough for this moment in time. The second and final part I will do over the next couple of days. I have to admit, I have been very encouraged by the amount of people that have read or listened to these stories, because I write books and stuff, and I've got a couple ready for publication, to be honest with you, but I enjoy writing wee small stories like this. I mean, you take an hour to read if you're a reader. I'm having to read it slow and keep one eye on a laptop and another on a video. It's fucking not easy, let me tell you. But let me also say, I wish you all a very good night. I thank you so much, I really do, for listening and tuning in. I wish you well, a good life, God bless, and as always, the love does go with you. Take care.